Introduce Lloyd today.
Here we go.
He says that impromptu speaking is probably the most common kind of public speaking we do. Think about how many times every day someone asks you a question about something, or that you have to give someone a quick explanation of something. Everything you say is in reality an impromptu speech. The trick is to appear knowledgeable and organized. In Project 1, Impromptu Speaking, from the Specialty Speeches Advanced Communication Series Manual, Lloyd Smith will attempt to do so. His evaluator and teaching
There's a number of good choices here. I'm completely intrigued with what asymmetric warfare looks like.
Thank you. Asymmetric warfare is one of those technical terms that doesn't seem to mean much to most of us because we're not professional warriors, but it means a lot. In fact, it means nearly everything to many nations and has meant that throughout history. The definition of asymmetric warfare is simple. It's a war in which the two sides are separated from one another by a large technological gap. In other words, like a guerrilla army, say, against a regular conventional army. The guerrilla warfare would be a perfect example of asymmetric warfare. Or a primarily religious army as opposed to a regular, secular, normal army. The easiest way to think about that, of course, is the war in Afghanistan that the U.S. has been involved in now for almost, 11 years. It's the longest war in U.S. history. It's a classic asymmetrical war in that the U.S. has a regular military force there. Now, it is true our military force is trying to engage in counterinsurgency, specializing in that, but it is a national army. The opposing force, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, is not. It's a classic guerrilla force. Guerrilla forces, guerrillas in guerrilla warfare, not guerrilla like, with bananas. Guerrilla armies arise typically from a local indigenous population, and they're very often motivated by things other than national glory. Things like defending their homeland, defending their religion, that sort of thing. Now, you would think that the United States would not have much trouble with a bunch of ragtag guys with old AK-47s and turbans on their head. But as you know from the news, we've had considerable trouble with those people. This is not a surprising thing. There has been exactly one asymmetric war in human history where the regular national army managed to defeat the indigenous guerrilla forces. And that was the Boer War that the British were involved in the late 1800s and very start of the 20th century. The only way the British won that war was by sending in 1,000 times the number of soldiers that the Boers had and inventing concentration camps to kill all of the Boers. And they won the war that way, although they lost the overall war for the hearts and minds. Now, what does this teach us? Well, it teaches us something very important. We don't learn from history is the main thing it teaches us. If you think about it, the U.S. was involved in another asymmetric war that was the second longest war in U.S. history. That would be the war in Vietnam. And the interesting thing about that war is that the United States did not lose one single battle during the Vietnam War, not one, but we lost the war. And that tends to be the case with asymmetric warfare. Perfect illustration to that is the British in Afghanistan. When the British Empire was beginning to break up after the American Revolution, which, by the way, was another asymmetric war where the indigenous army, the Americans, beat the best and strongest national army on earth, the British. But in any event, as the British Empire began to break up, they had a big problem in the area around India and Afghanistan and Pakistan and whatnot. And they decided to abandon India, which they did in slow motion. That really didn't occur until 1947. But when they were struggling to hang on to Afghanistan, they had about 25 times the number of warriors that the Afghans had, and the Afghans beat them. Now, Afghanistan's an interesting case because the Mongols stopped at the Afghan border and would not attack them because they were afraid of them. Alexander the Great's army got to the Afghan border and his generals refused to go on because they were afraid of the Afghans. The British got their rear ends kicked and were driven out of Afghanistan. And the Russians got kicked out after about 6 years. The Russians at least had the sense to put their Vietnam War right on their border, so it's much cheaper to fight than Vietnam was for us. And now we're in the process of declaring victory and going home. The lesson in all of this is simple. It's probably impossible for a national army, no matter how good, to beat an indigenous guerrilla-type army. And the one and only illustration in world history of that happening is the Boer War, where the British allegedly won the war. Now, the bad news for all of us in this is that it's highly likely that from now on, most of the wars we're going to see are going to be asymmetric wars. They're easy to do. You just have to have about $100 each for AK-47s, and there are about 20 million AK-47s in circulation in the arms markets around the world. That and an internet connection so that your head guys can get themselves a little publicity, and you've got an army, an indigenous army, as opposed to the U.S. Army, which is very, very expensive. It's by far the finest on earth, probably the finest in human history, but it's quite costly. You know, we've spent roughly $1 trillion or so in Afghanistan so far, and we haven't gotten out of that woods yet. So what I'd like you to think about is this. We need to be really, really careful about who we get in a war with, because they're tough to win, even when it looks like they're not. There was a guy whose name I have just lost. He was former Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff, who eventually got indicted and sent to prison. Libby, Scooter Libby, who said that he thought that about every 10 years the U.S. should pick some little country and slap it around in order to scare everybody and make them understand who the boss of the world was. And unfortunately, we did that.